My daughter called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me she had sold my entire life out from under me, and she said it the way most people cancel a dentist appointment. Dad, listen, I don't have a lot of time. The oyster company, the restaurant, the boats, it's all sold. We closed yesterday. The new people want everybody off the property by the end of the week, so you'll need to find somewhere. We've got you a room at the motel out by the highway for a couple of nights. Okay? I have to go. The car's here. And then the line just went quiet. Not even a goodbye. Just a little three-tone chirp the phone makes when the other person hangs up first. I was standing in my own kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, looking out the window at Willapa Bay. The water flat and silver the way it gets right before the tide turns. I had been looking at that exact view for 31 years. And I remember the strangest thing went through my head. I didn't think, how could she? I didn't think this can't be real. What I thought, clear as a bell, was, "Sweetheart, you forgot something." But she'd already hung up, so she didn't hear it. If she'd stayed on the line another 10 seconds, she might have asked what I meant. She might have laughed at me, told me I was getting confused in my old age, told me to just go on to the motel and be a good boy. And I would have let her. I would have let her keep believing she'd won. Before I tell you how a phone call on a Tuesday turned into the worst week of my children's lives, do me a favor. If you've ever poured everything you had and the people who treated it like it was owed to them, hit that subscribe button and tell me down in the comments where you're listening from. I read every single one, and if you believe that loyalty is something you earn and not something you inherit, go ahead and like this. It helps an old man more than you know. My name is Warren Tidewell. I'm 67 years old, and for most of my life, I was the oyster man on the south end of the bay. That probably doesn't sound like much. People hear oyster farmer, and they picture some fellow in rubber boots scraping mud. And sure, that was part of it. But what I built over 40 years wasn't a little shack. Tidewell Oyster Company supplied half the good restaurants in Seattle and Portland. We had a name people trusted. We had a waterfront oyster bar right on the dock that food writers drove 3 hours to eat at. My late wife Susanna ran the front of the house, and I ran the water. And between us, we turned a flooded acre of nothing into something that fed our family and a couple dozen others. Susanna passed 9 years ago. Cancer. The slow, cruel kind that gives you just enough time to start hoping before it takes it back. She died in the upstairs bedroom of the house I'm telling you about, with the window open so she could hear the gulls, holding my hand and telling me to take care of our daughter. I promised her I would. I want you to remember that promise, because it matters at the end of this. Here's the part I have to own, because none of what came after happens without it. About a year before Susanna died, when we were drowning in medical bills and lawyers were whispering about estate taxes and probate, I made a decision I thought was wise. I sat down with my accountant, and I moved the business, the company, the restaurant building, the equipment, the brand, into my daughter's name. The whole operation. On paper, Tidewell Oyster Company became hers. I did it out of love. I want that understood. I did it so that when I was gone, she wouldn't lose half of it to the government. So the things Susanna and I bled for would pass clean to the next generation. My daughter cried when I signed those papers. She put her arms around my neck like she did when she was 6 years old, and she said, "Daddy, this will always be your home. You'll always be the heart of this place. I'd never let anything happen to you." I believed her. God help me, I believed every word. So when she called me that Tuesday morning, the betrayal wasn't just that she'd sold the business. It was that she'd taken the very thing I'd handed her as an act of trust, and she'd used it as a knife. The reason it happened was my son-in-law. I'll be honest with you about him. I never liked the man, and I'm not going to pretend I did just to sound noble. He had the kind of handshake that's too firm, and the kind of eyes that are always doing arithmetic. He talked my daughter into one bad venture after another. A restaurant in Tacoma that folded in 8 months, some cryptocurrency thing, a real estate fund that turned out to be a man in a rented office. Every time it cratered, the money came out of the oyster company, out of my company, the one with her name on it now. I knew they were in trouble. I didn't know how deep. I found out exactly how deep about 2 hours after that phone call, when the trucks came. I heard them before I saw them. You live on a gravel road long enough. You know the sound of every vehicle that has any business being on it. And this one had no business. A big moving truck, the kind with the ramp, grinding up the drive. Behind it, a black SUV so clean it looked wet. My son-in-law got out of the SUV. He didn't knock. Why would he knock? In his mind, the place wasn't mine anymore. He walked up to my front door, and he used a key. My key. The spare we kept under the planter for 30 years so the kids could let themselves in. The door opened, and he walked into my front room like he was inspecting a warehouse. 2 big fellows in moving company shirts coming in behind him with hand trucks and rolls of tape. "Warren," he said. He didn't look at me. He was looking at the furniture. "Let's keep this moving. We're on a tight schedule." I stepped in front of him. My hands were shaking, but I want to be clear, it wasn't fear. I hadn't been afraid of a man in 40 years. It was rage, the cold kind, the kind that drops down into your stomach and goes very still. "What is this?" I said. "What in God's name do you think you're doing in my house?" He finally looked at me, and he had the gall to look bored. "It's not your house. Legally it never was, not for a while now. It belongs to Meridian Coast Partners as of yesterday afternoon. You're a guest who's overstayed." He snapped his fingers at the movers. Actually snapped them. "Start in here. Anything that looks like it's worth something. Load it. The rest can go to the curb." And that's when I watched a stranger in a moving company shirt pick up the framed photograph off my mantel. The one of Susanna on our wedding day. 26 years old, laughing with her veil blowing sideways in the wind off the bay, and toss it into a black contractor bag like it was an empty bottle. I'm 67. I've buried my parents, my wife, and 2 of my best friends. I have stood at a lot of gravesides, and I'm telling you that the sound of that frame hitting the bottom of a garbage bag did something to me that none of those funerals did. It cut a wire. I went and I dug that photograph out of the bag with my own hands. Glass cracked across Susanna's face, and I held it against my chest, and my son-in-law looked at me holding it and he laughed. A short little laugh through his nose. "Don't be so dramatic," he said. "It's just stuff." I called my daughter, straight to voicemail. Called again. This time it didn't even ring, it went dead instantly, that flat little sound. She had blocked my number. My own daughter, the girl I taught to shuck an oyster when she was 8, had blocked me on her phone like I was a telemarketer. So I left. I want you to know I didn't make a scene. I didn't give my son-in-law the satisfaction. I put a change of clothes, my wife's cracked photograph, a shoebox of papers, and my old work knife into a duffel bag. And I drove my 20-year-old pickup down the gravel road and out to the motel by the highway. It was exactly what you're picturing. A row of doors painted the color of a bruise, a flickering sign, a window unit that rattled like it was full of marbles. The room smelled like cigarettes that had been smoked there in 1998. I sat down on the edge of a bed with a comforter, the texture of a tarp, and for a few minutes I just held my wife's broken picture and let myself be an old man who'd lost everything. And then I stopped, because somewhere in the back of my head, that thought from the morning came floating up again, calm as the tide. "You forgot something." See, here's what my daughter never understood. And while my son-in-law was far too lazy to ever check, and it's the thing I'd been carrying quietly for almost 10 years, like a card you keep face down on the table. When I signed the company over, I gave her everything she could see. The buildings, the boats, the trucks, the freezers, the tables in the oyster bar, the sign on the road with our name on it. But an oyster company isn't its buildings. An oyster company is the water. It's the right to grow shellfish on a specific stretch of tideland, and out here, those tidelands belong to the state of Washington. You don't own them. You lease them, and you can only hold that lease if you personally carry a certified shellfish operator's permit, which the state grants to a person not a company. My lease, every productive acre of mudflat that made Tidewell Oyster Company worth a nickel, was tied to my name and my permit. And the terms of that lease, I'd read them, even if no one in my family ever had, said in plain language that it could not be assigned or transferred to a new operator without the state's written approval, and that it terminated automatically if the permit holder ceased to be actively involved in the operation. My daughter owned the buildings. I owned the water under them. And the water is the whole thing. There was a second card, too. Years back, on the advice of a lawyer who was smarter than all of us, I'd kept the name itself. The trademark Tidewell, the recipes, the wholesale supply contracts with all those restaurants in Seattle and Portland, in a separate little entity that I controlled and only I controlled. I'd done it to protect the brand if the business ever went bankrupt. I never imagined I'd need it to protect myself. So when my daughter sold Tidewell Oyster Company to Meridian Coast Partners for $4.2 million in cash, and I learned the number later, 4.2 here is what she actually sold them. A restaurant building, some boats, and a few acres of mudflat with no permit, no transferable lease, and no legal right to use the name on the sign or sell to a single one of our customers. She sold them an empty barn and a famous name she didn't own. She sold them the right to stand in the mud and watch, but I didn't know yet whether I had it in me to let them walk straight off the cliff. A man wants to believe his child is incapable of leaving him to die in a motel. So before I did anything, I had to be sure. I had to hear it from her own mouth. That night, my daughter and son-in-law went out to celebrate. I knew where because I knew them. There's a place up the coast, in the resort town, white tablecloths, a wine list as thick as a Bible, the kind of restaurant my daughter had always wanted to belong to, instead of the one her parents actually ran. I drove up there in my rattling old truck, and I parked it in the dark across the lot. An old man in a 20-year-old Ford, invisible the way old men always are. They were out on the patio. I could see them through the string lights. My daughter in a dress I'd never seen. My son-in-law leaning back in his chair like he owned the ocean. They had a bottle of champagne in a silver bucket. They were laughing. I'm not proud of what I did next, but I'd do it again. I walked a long way around, close to the patio railing, into the shadow of a big planted hedge, close enough to hear. Two old people at the table next to theirs were just finishing up. So for a couple of minutes, nobody noticed the gray-haired man standing in the dark with his hands in his jacket pockets. I heard my son-in-law say something about a villa, something about how they'd be wheels up to Europe by the weekend, how they were done with this gray, wet, smelly little corner of the country forever. And then I heard my daughter say the thing I will carry to my own grave. Another woman at the table. A friend, I suppose, asked about me. Asked, but what about your dad? Where's he going to go? And my daughter said, in a voice as light as the champagne in her glass, honestly, he's 70. He's had his whole life. The motel will hold him for a few days, and after that, that's not really our problem. There's state facilities for people like him. If he runs out of money, that's nature. We did our part. That's nature. About me. The man who taught her to swim in that bay. That's not really our problem. My son-in-law lifted his glass and said, to the next chapter. And my daughter clinked it and laughed and threw her head back. And the string lights caught her throat, and she looked happier than I'd seen her look in 20 years. I walked back to my truck in the dark. I didn't feel sad anymore. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who've never been there. The grief just cauterized. Burned shut. I'd come up there with a tiny, foolish hope still flickering, that maybe if I confronted them, they'd break down. Maybe they were just frightened people who'd done a desperate thing. That hope died on that patio, and it didn't die gentle. It got murdered by a toast. I sat in the truck, and I called the one man I trusted with this, my lawyer, Atticus Lund. We'd known each other 40 years. He'd handled the lease, the trademark, the whole quiet architecture of it. He answered on the second ring, the way he does when he already suspects something's wrong. Warren, what happened? I told him. All of it, the phone call, the trucks, my wife's photograph in the garbage bag, the motel, the patio. That's nature. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very softly, Lord, Warren, I'm so sorry. Don't be, I said. And I heard my own voice, and it didn't sound like a sad old man's voice anymore. It sounded like the voice I used to use when I was negotiating supply contracts with men who thought they could push me around. I need you to do something, Atticus. I need you to do it tonight. Tell me. I want you to send the state the notice that I am withdrawing as the active operator on the Tideland lease, effective immediately. I want it time-stamped tonight. And first thing in the morning, I want a formal letter to Meridian Coast Partners, copied to whatever lawyer my daughter used, informing them that the operation they believe they purchased has no transferable shellfish lease, no permit, and no license to use the Tidewell name, all of which are held personally by me and are not part of any sale my daughter had the authority to make. There was a silence on the line that went on so long, I thought the call had dropped. Warren, Atticus said finally. You understand what that does? The minute that letter lands, Meridian realizes they paid $4 million for a building on mudflats they can't farm. They are not going to come after you. You're just the leaseholder protecting his own rights. They are going to come after your daughter. For fraud, for selling them something she didn't have the right to sell. They will throw everything they have at her, and they have a great deal. This won't be a lawsuit. This will be a prosecution. I looked through my windshield at the patio. My daughter was taking a picture of the champagne bottle, making a little kissing face at her own phone. I know exactly what it does, I said. You could stop it. We could call Meridian tonight, warn them off, kill the sale before the money's spent. Your daughter would be broke and humiliated, but she wouldn't be a criminal. There's a version of tonight where she just loses the money. You don't have to choose the version where she loses her freedom. I thought about it. I want you to know that I genuinely thought about it, sitting there in that dark parking lot. I thought about the 8-year-old girl learning to shuck an oyster without cutting her thumb. I thought about Susanna's hand in mine. Take care of our daughter. And then I thought about a stranger in a moving shirt dropping my wife's face into a garbage bag while my daughter sipped champagne and called my dying nature. No, I said. We don't warn anybody. They didn't warn me. Let them have their night, Atticus. Let them dream about their might, Atticus. Let them dream about their villa. File the notice tonight. Send the letter at 8 in the morning. And Atticus, I want to be there when they find out. He let out a long breath. Remind me, he said, never to cross you. Good night, Atticus. I drove back to the bruise-colored motel and I slept better than I had in a week. Funny thing. The next morning was clear and cold, the kind of blue October morning that makes the bay look like hammered tin. I drove out to the property at 7:45, and I parked my truck right in the middle of the gravel drive where it couldn't be missed. They were already there. Of course they were. They'd come out for one last gloating look at the place they thought they'd just cashed in. My son-in-law's SUV was parked by the dock, and the two of them were standing out by the oyster bar in their travel clothes, sunglasses on, ready for the airport, taking selfies in front of the water. There was a third car I didn't recognize, a sedan, and 2 men in suits standing beside it, looking at clipboards. Meridian's people, come to do their final walkthrough before they sent the demolition crews. And right behind my truck, pulling slowly up the gravel, came a county sheriff's vehicle, because Atticus does not do things by halves. And because what was about to happen needed a witness with a badge. My daughter saw me and her whole face changed. Dad? What are you? You can't be here. The new owners. Good morning, sweetheart, I said. That's when one of the men in suits, Meridian's lead, a man whose name I never bothered to learn, held up his phone and said, in a voice that had gone the color of skim milk, Could everybody hold on a second? I just got an email from our council, and I need somebody to explain to me what a ground lease reversion is and why our shellfish operating rights don't exist. I watched my son-in-law's face. I watched the swagger drain right out of it, like a tide going out. He looked at the Meridian man, then at my daughter, then at me. What is he talking about? He said. To no one. To everyone. So, I told them. Standing there in the gravel with the gulls wheeling overhead, I told them what they'd never bothered to read. I told them that an oyster company is not its buildings. It's its water. That the tidelands belong to the state, that the lease and the permit were mine, personally, and could not be transferred without the state's blessing. And that as of 11 o'clock the previous night, I had formally withdrawn as the operator, which under the terms terminated the lease entirely. I told them that the name Tidewell, the one painted on the sign, the one every restaurant in 2 cities knew, did not belong to the company my daughter sold. It belonged to me, and they had no license to use a letter of it. You sold them a barn, I said to my daughter, gently, almost. You sold them a barn and an empty piece of mud and a name that was never yours. There's nothing here to buy. There never was. The Meridian man was already on his phone, walking fast toward his car, the word fraud coming out of his mouth over and over. My daughter started to cry, not the pretty kind. The kind that comes up from somewhere real. Dad, she said. Dad, please. Fix it. You can fix it. Just tell them it's okay. Just sign whatever. I could, I said. Yesterday morning, before the trucks came, I'd have signed anything you put in front of me. If you'd come to me, if you'd sat at my kitchen table and said, Daddy, we're in trouble, we need help, I'd have signed the renewal, I'd have transferred the lease, I'd have given you the money myself and asked you to leave me my photograph and my coffee cup. You know I would have. That's the part you'll have to live with. You didn't have to take anything. I'd have given it. The deputy stepped forward then, because the Meridian people had asked him to, and because the law had its own opinion about a $4 million sale of property the seller didn't own. He read them their rights right there on the gravel, my daughter and my son-in-law, while the gulls screamed and the tide came in over beds that hadn't belonged to them for a single second. My daughter looked up at me with her mascara running in black lines down her face, her hands behind her back. We're family, she said. Daddy. We're your blood. You can't let them do this. And I'll tell you exactly what I felt because I promised you I'd be honest. For 1 second, the years collapsed and I didn't see a woman in handcuffs. I saw a little girl on the dock holding up her first oyster shell like it was a trophy. For 1 second. And then I heard it again. The way you can't unhear a thing once it's been said. He's had his whole life. That's nature. You keep saying that word, I said. Family. You say it like a magic spell that's supposed to erase everything else. Where was family when you sent a stranger to throw your mother's face in the trash? Where was family when you blocked my number? Where was family when you sat on that patio and called me nature? I leaned down a little so she'd hear every word clear. When you sold this place, you told the whole world I was a burden. A line item. A bad debt to be written off. I straightened back up. Well, look where we are. I'm not a burden anymore, sweetheart. I'm just the man who owns the water. The deputy helped them into the back of the car. My son-in-law went quiet, his head down. My daughter twisted around to look at me through the glass the whole time, her mouth making my name over and over without any sound. Atticus came up beside me. He had his briefcase in his hand and his face was pale. He's a good man and good men don't enjoy this, even when it's just. Warren, he said quietly. Meridian's going to sue them for the 4.2 plus damages. The county's going to press the fraud charges hard. If you want, we can file a civil suit on top of it. Unauthorized sale, the cost of the cleanup, the damage they did to the buildings. We'd win. They'd never climb out from under it as long as they live. I looked at the patrol car as it backed down the drive. I looked at the bay. Gone all silver again. The water that was mine and had always been mine. No, I said. Don't file the civil suit. He blinked at me. Warren. They tried to take everything you have. I know what they did, I said, but I don't need their money. And I don't want to spend whatever years I've got left feeding off their misery. Let Meridian have its pound of flesh. Let the law do its work. That's enough. I picked the cracked photograph of Susanna out of my jacket and looked at her laughing face under the broken glass. I made her a promise I'd take care of our daughter. And I think, God help me, I think this is the last way I've got left to keep it. Maybe consequences are the only thing I never gave that girl. Maybe that's the one thing she actually needs. I didn't watch them drive away. I turned my back on the whole scene. The stunned men from Meridian. The silent demolition equipment they brought too early. The spot in the gravel where I'd held my wife's picture against my chest the day before. I walked down to the end of the dock. The boards I'd laid with my own hands. And I stood there and breathed in the cold and the salt and the diesel and the mud. The smell of 40 years of my life. It was over. The old barracuda still had teeth. But I'll tell you something nobody warns you about. When you finally bite back, the blood doesn't taste sweet. It just tastes like something you had to do. The hardest lesson of my life came to me on that dock, and I'll give it to you for free, because I paid full price. Blood does not buy you loyalty. I spent 50 years believing that being a good father meant giving and giving until there was nothing left, and all I was really doing was raising someone who learned that I would always give more. Love without a limit isn't love. It's just a door with no lock, and sooner or later somebody walks through it and takes the furniture. You can rebuild a fortune. I'm 67 and I'm going to grow oysters on that bay until the day I drop. And the company will have its name back and its customers back inside a year. But you cannot rebuild your own dignity once you've handed it to people who only ever saw you as a bank with a heartbeat. Don't give it away. Not to anybody. Not even to your own children. If you believe that respect has to be earned and never just assumed, do me that favor and hit the like button and tell me down in the comments. Have you ever had to let someone you loved face the consequences of what they did, even when it broke your heart to do it? Tell me your story. I'll be reading. I read everyone. I stayed on that dock until the tide came all the way in, and then I went and I hung my wife's photograph back over the mantel, cracked glass and all. Because some things you don't replace, you just keep them, and you keep going. I used to think the kindest thing a father could do was say yes. Yes to the money, yes to the bailouts, yes to the deed with my daughter's name on it. I told myself that was love. It took a stranger dropping my wife's photograph into a garbage bag for me to understand that what I'd really been doing all those years was teaching my own child that I had no bottom, no floor, no point where giving stopped. A door with no lock isn't generosity. It's an invitation, and eventually somebody walks through it and carries out the furniture. Everything that happened to my daughter and my son-in-law, they built with their own hands. I didn't put the handcuffs on them. They sold something that was never theirs to sell, and the law simply caught up to the choice they'd already made on that patio when they raised a glass to leaving me to rot. Cause and effect. You can't outrun it. And you can't sweet-talk it. And no amount of champagne makes it forget your address. The mudflats didn't care that she was my blood. The lease didn't care that I'd loved her since before she could walk. Actions have weight, and the bill always comes. If there's anything I'd hand to a younger man, it's 3 things I learned the hard way standing on that dock. The first is to keep your sense of right and wrong even when keeping it costs you. I gave my daughter everything except consequences. And a person who never meets a consequence never grows a conscience. The second is to use your head as carefully as your heart. I held that water for 9 years, not out of suspicion, but out of clear thinking. And clear thinking is what let me protect what Susanna and I built when sentiment alone would have left me homeless in a motel. And the third is the plain backbone to do the hard thing once you know it's right. It would have been so much easier to sign whatever they shoved at me and call it peace. Easier isn't the same as right. I'm 67. I'll grow oysters on that bay until I drop, and the company will have its name back inside a year. I'll rebuild the money, what I won't do, ever again. is hand my dignity to people who only ever saw me as a bank with a heartbeat. Love your children with everything you have, but love them enough to let them feel the floor when they fall, because catching them every single time isn't saving them. It's just teaching them how to fall on someone else. I hung Susanna's cracked photograph back over the mantel, and I keep going, lighter than I've been in years.